What a powerful discussion by those extraordinary ladies. As the Director of Creative Diversity for the BBC, these are complex issues that my colleagues and I are incredibly passionate about. And our goal is to ensure that we create a safe space for this type of dialogue to take place in order for us to move forward. And I think these are conversations that have to be had at institutions and organizations around the world, and particularly in an African context. So I'm so glad that this conversation was happening here today. So thank you, Deegan, Marie-Rose, and Nora for sharing with us. I'd now like us to pivot to Africa and the opportunities, the investing opportunities on the continent. So we are looking at the future of investing in African visionaries. Oh, what a title that I like. So I'd like to invite Katie Bunten-Wamaru from the African Visionary Fund, Keith Kibirango from the Bantu Impact Foundation, Dr. Frank Aswani from the African Venture Philanthropy Alliance, and Lior from the Roddenberry Foundation to join us online.
Good evening. My name is Lior. I'm the CEO of the Roddenberry Foundation. Thank you all for joining us for our session titled The Future of Investing in African Visionaries. Today, we're going to be discussing the role African visionaries have in driving social change on the continent and what we can do to support them. For most of us, 2020 has been very present focused. We've been forced to live from moment to moment, day to day, and week to week. But today we're going to look ahead and we're going to discuss the future, and specifically how we as a field can better support African visionaries and what we can do to mitigate the challenges they face. There are significant challenges, but the opportunity is great as well. Africa's workforce will be the world's largest by 2040. The continent has a third of the planet's mineral resources. 60% of the continent is 25 years or younger. And according to the World Bank, of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world in 2018, 6 were in Africa. So the potential for change is extraordinary. Joining me today to discuss this are Dr. Frank Aswani of the African Venture Philanthropy Alliance, Katie Bunten-Wamaru of the African Visionary Fund, and Keith Kibirango of the Bantu Impact Foundation. Each of our panelists has a wealth of experience in investing in and supporting African visionaries, and they have an intimate knowledge of who and how social change is being driven, what's missing, and how we can do better to support these visionaries. You'll also notice that we've intentionally used the term visionary, which I think is an important framework for this conversation. It speaks to the broad and myriad ways in which change can be affected and by whom. So as I ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves now, I'm also going to ask them to explain what they think about when they mean visionary and why it's an important concept for us to use. So let's jump in. Frank, can I ask you to introduce yourself, talk a little bit about who you are and what you're doing and what visionary means to you?
Thank you, Leo. Good evening, everyone. I hope everyone's well. My name is Frank Kaswani. I'm the CEO of AVPA. We are building out a network of social investors in Africa who will collaborate to increase the flow of capital into social investments. Africa faces a huge SDG financing challenge. We need something in the range of $1.2 trillion annually between now and 2030 to close our SDG financing gap. And we are likely to face a huge challenge if we keep depending on our traditional sources of capital, which is aid and government funding, both of which have come under huge pressure during this COVID crisis. In terms of a visionary for me, I think what makes visionaries very unique is they fall in love with the problem they're solving. These are people who are committed to not being so much in love with the solution, but the problem they're solving. And so they will tackle a problem and they will fight tooth and nail, switching and pivoting between different solutions until they find that they've made a better type and place for everyone who they're trying to support and aid through the solution. So that for me is what makes visionaries unique. They're tenacious, they're persistent, they're solutions driven, and they're people who fall in love with the problem.
Great, thank you, Frank. Keith, let me turn to you. A little bit about yourself and what does visionary mean to you?
Thank you very much. My name is Kibirango. I am wearing two hats today. I am the head of Africa Philanthropy at Save the Children UK, and I also volunteer for a small charity called Bantu Impact Foundation. And if I may speak about the foundation, is that the foundation exists to support and to invest in small and medium-sized enterprises in Africa. As you can imagine, borrowing from Frank, there is a huge financing gap when it comes to SMEs in Africa. We are looking to the tune of $300 billion that is actually needed to finance SMEs in Africa. And as you can imagine, there is a lot of risk averseness. COVID hasn't helped. Increasingly, we are seeing this gap from the investors that want to invest and those that actually are seeking the money. So there is this, what I would call the lack of deal flow, whereby the money is not reaching the people who need it, and the people who need the money cannot access it. And at Abantu, we are trying to look at what we call the missing middle. Those enterprises, those businesses that are too big for microfinance, but they are also too small. They are not, international conglomerates. What do we do? How do we ensure that they actually have got the capacity, they've got the skills, they've got the contacts to be able to thrive and grow their businesses? In terms of visionaries, I would actually look at the very same entrepreneurs. We are looking at millions and millions of people in the most difficult of circumstances who are resilient, who work hard, who are creative, who are making a lot from nothing, and they're employing the largest number of people across Africa. For me, when I look at small, medium-sized enterprises and those entrepreneurs, I consider them the visionaries, because with very little, they have managed to do a lot. And with just a little more support, a little more of a helping hand, we will be surprised at the sheer volume of amazingness that they will do. So for me, that is what I would consider a visionary. Thank you.
Thank you, Keith. Katie? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
I'm Katie Bunten-Wamaru. I'm the Executive Director of the African Visionary Fund, which is a pooled grant-making fund focused on driving more resources to African visionaries. Obviously, the term is dear to our hearts at the African Visionary Fund since it's in our name. And, I think that we come from kind of the nonprofit side. We talk about social change makers a lot at the African Visionary Fund. And when I think about visionaries, I think the term social entrepreneur has become kind of overused in some ways, and it means everything and anything. And there's a spectrum of the actual work of the models. Do they generate revenue, or do they rely on philanthropic dollars? And that's kind of how people think about, is it a for-profit social business or an NGO or something in between? And I think that using the term African visionary is encompassing all those potential models and really focusing on the vision and what does that person see, and how do they, I think about African visionaries as people who see possibility where other people think there isn't some, where it's just an impossible problem, it's too entrenched, it's too difficult, and they can kind of see something possible beyond that others can't. And I think what's really important about thinking about African visionaries in particular is that their proximity to the problems that they're working on is much closer. And so their ability to zoom out and see this big vision and see this possibility in the future is there, but also their ability to zoom in and understand all the complexities around that problem, the cultural things, the context that you have to be from that community to truly understand and be able to navigate around. I think that's what kind of makes African visionaries for me, the biggest potential social change makers on the continent, is that ability to see the big vision and be super dialed into the problem on the ground.
Thanks, Katie. And I think we've probably all seen this the last 6 or 7 months, is the incredible agility with which these visionaries have been pivoting or amplifying their work because of COVID. And I think it's been an extraordinary lens into how talented these folks really are. and how quickly they can adjust to the circumstances on the ground, and why we need to be investing in them. So let's jump in. I think let's start with this question, which is essentially that we know they're out there. We know that they're amazing, but there are significant challenges that limit their impact. And so the question for each of you is, what role can investors and donors play in both homegrown and international, in addressing these challenges? How can we as a field better support these visionaries and help mitigate some of the challenges that they face? And so can each of you speak to what these challenges are, and what we can do both within the country that they're working in, and then internationally? And Frank, let me go back to you. What are your thoughts on this specifically?
I think that there's a couple of different things. I think the first thing is we don't celebrate these visionaries enough. They're not visible enough. I think too many of them are not put on platform to showcase the guts, the resilience, the boldness at tackling big issues facing the most vulnerable on the continent. So the first thing I think we need to do is recognize that just amongst us, as a lot of people making some huge sacrifices, and giving them the opportunity to see how we can appreciate the sacrifices they're making to solve some common issues. That's the first thing. And the second thing is to ask ourselves, is some of the solutions they're offering have huge opportunities to not just solve problems, but solve them at scale. And how do we help some of these guys become sustainable? And part of what we need to do is recognize that we can support them through offering tailored financing and access to capital that many of them do need at the various stages of their growth of their solutions. So how can we bring together and build an ecosystem of investors who can offer grants when they need it, when they're at the most risky stage before they have proof of concept? How do we get those grants to elevate them to the point whereby they can attract the next level investor? So there's all that kind of stuff I think we need to think about. The third thing is to recognize that these guys, the visionaries, not only require financial capital, but also non-financial support. In many cases, they require training, they require IT, they require financial support, they require CFOs, all of those kind of people I think are very necessary. And the third piece, I think, for me, is to recognize that also we need to provide an environment for them to thrive. I think if you go to many places, some of these visionaries don't have an identity within the legal structures. They're not recognized as a group of people who are doing something really different. There's very few places in Africa that recognize who a social entrepreneur is, or offer incentives for support for some of them through various giving means and other ways. So I think there's multiple things in which we can do to support them as they go through the journey of creating and delivering change.
And is there a role that homegrown investors can play, or international investors can play, that might be different from each other? Do you see a difference there?
I definitely think so. I think we as Africans have lived the problem, we should live the solution. So I personally believe that African social investors, especially philanthropists, should take the lead in getting these guys off the ground. We should be the ones taking the higher risk upfront. And by the time international investors are coming in, we should be giving them a pretty good developed kind of pipeline of opportunities that they can fund for growth and scale. But I think a lot of the upfront risk, personally, my belief is that should be carried by Africans. And we then support them to the point whereby they can take additional support from and bigger support from international players. And that's how I think the relay race can work.
Keith, let me turn to you. What role do you think that investors and donors can play in helping mitigate some of the challenges that these visionaries face, and perhaps even speak to what some of these challenges are? I think it'd be interesting for the audience to hear, and they probably know themselves, but let's talk about that a little bit. Oh, Keith, I think you might be on mute.
My apologies. If I speak about 2020 and I speak about 2021, where should we say the visionaries are, money has become harder to come by. Whether you are a charity, whether you are an SME, it's become harder to come by. There's more isolation now, not only because of the lockdown, but also because of distance. In some cases, technology is not actually filling the gap that we would want it to fill. And yet at the same time, we still have investors and we still have donors that are looking only at the brick and mortar. They're looking at how many children am I helping, or how many bags are you producing in your factory. What they're not ideally looking at is the organizational development of the charity or of the SME, whereby you're like, right now is the time for us to actually be supporting the resilience, the growth of these organizations, so that they are around today and tomorrow to be able to serve the communities. If we continue to skip over them and, as donors, focus only at the beneficiary, there will not be anyone left to actually support the beneficiaries in the long term. So for me, my number one solution right now is look at the organizational development, the resilience, what they need right now to survive this not very easy time. And while looking at that, also, why not focus at homegrown solutions? And Frank has already touched on this. If I may give you an example, when it comes to a lot of impact investment, decisions are made, the really important decisions are made outside the continent, which means that the people making the decisions may not exactly know what is happening on the ground. The decisions will take a lot longer, and some of these businesses need the investment yesterday. They do not need it in 6 months, they need it right now. So how do we ensure that decisions are made on ground? How do we ensure that the homegrown solutions are going through? And as Frank said, the philanthropists on the continent should be first in line, and then we can look at the defeats of this world much later. And finally, the flexibility of investment and funding is really vital. I'll give you an example of funders who will literally go and fund only malaria at the expense of children in that village who actually may be suffering from malnutrition. Or they go and they say, we're only supporting these SMEs that are doing only, health issues, or they're dealing with IT. But what you need in the community is not IT. You need more. You need value added. So it's that flexibility that is needed right now, whereby an investor, you listen, you're flexible, and you actually adjust according to what is on the ground. For me, I feel that those are the challenges, but those are some of the solutions that donors and philanthropists can actually bring in onto the table. Thank you.
Yes, it's the funder bad practices are unfortunately universal. So the need for more unrestricted funding, less reporting, and a focus on the organizations and their health rather than only on the impact on the beneficiaries is desperately needed, I think, universally.
Absolutely, but I have had conversations whereby some donors and investors have actually woken up to the fact that they will do more good if they actually support the organization. So hopefully, it's not easy, but we'll get there.
I agree. I hope so too. Katie, what do you think? What are your thoughts on some of the challenges facing the visionaries on the continent, and what role can international and homegrown funders play in mitigating some of those challenges?
Yeah, I mean, I think we come at this from a pretty particular lens where we're really focused on the challenges related to funding and the challenges related to philanthropic funding in particular. So and I also think that just given my background and where I am in the world, I can speak a little bit more to kind of the international donors' role in supporting African visionaries. And, if you just look at US foundation giving, right? US foundations give $9 billion to the African continent every year in philanthropic funding. Less than 5% of that goes through organizations led by Africans. So more than 95% of the funding that US philanthropy is directing to the continent is being controlled, and then decisions are being made by people who are not from the communities where the work is done. And so I think that's a huge challenge. And I think what is important for international funders to focus on is that question of role. Like, really, what are we doing and who should we be in this conversation as someone coming in from the outside, right? I think that we kind of forget how important some of the decisions that are made in US boardrooms are to where money actually flows. And I think if we as international funders thought of ourselves more as allies than gatekeepers, a lot of decisions would be made differently, right? If we're not the leaders of this work, we are not the people who should be deciding where money goes into what sectors, into each community. We are supporters, we have resources to bring to this, and that's important, but it's almost, when you hear kind of just how much talent and potential there is on the continent for change, our role really is, how do we resource that talent and that potential and get out of the way? Because we should not be the ones kind of in the lead. And I think if you really, as an international funder, can take that posture in your work of an ally and not a gatekeeper, you start to also realize that oftentimes we bring our own biases and perceptions into this work. When we talk about things like scale or impact measurement, we're bringing our own perceptions of what we think that should look like on a continent that, you know, if you're not from, you're just not going to have as much context to understand the nuance of what those things mean on the ground. And so I think taking that kind of deep seated look at, like, really, what should my role be here? How can I be an ally and a supporter to these organizations, and kind of get out of the way so that they can reach their full potential, and challenge my own kind of biases and perceptions. I think that would both open up more funding to African visionaries, because we would see the need to prioritize their leadership. And also, I think, just provide more clarity even for someone coming in about really how can I be supportive? How can I be an ally in this sector and not kind of further these inequities that eventually end up doing harm in communities?
I think one of the things that we've seen with in the last, or all of this year is how the degree to which COVID has highlighted these inequities and brought them to light. They've always been there, but we now see them with a little bit greater clarity. And you know, it's been said that we're all in the same storm, but we're in different boats. And so, Katie, what are your thoughts on ways in which funders can? You've just addressed a number of different things that we can do. How do we make funding more equal, more inclusive, more diverse, particularly for those of us who are not in Africa but are supporting African visionaries? Yeah, can you speak to where can we find places for greater equity, and what can we do differently?
Sure, yeah, and I think that, you know, so the African Visionary Fund is a new entity. We just started in 2020 fully as an independent entity, and that the idea for the fund, the way it's kind of come together, has come out of this question of, like, okay, we're a set of funders interested in more equity, and maybe we don't know where to start. And there's obstacles. You know, if you look at US philanthropy, oftentimes they only fund organizations with a 501c3. Many African-led organizations don't have access to that registration, or, you know, it's not really important to them delivering work on the ground. And so I do think that there's kind of a few ways to tackle it. I think there are ways, and there are foundations like the Siegel Family Foundation, who are great examples, where they have structured their entire team and grant making around funding directly to African visionaries. So it is possible. I also think there's lots of funders who need a bridge. They need some support. Maybe they do very large grants and don't have a team on the ground that can find and vet and support a portfolio of African visionaries. And so the African Visionary Fund really kind of came out of that need for a bridge. And one of the things that we did that I think is important for funders to think about, particularly international funders, is who makes decisions within your organization, who is your governance structure, and how much proximity do they have to the work that you're funding. And so as we got kind of the African Visionary Fund off the ground, the first thing we did was set up a founding working group to guide our work, to guide our model, that group is overwhelmingly African social entrepreneurs and social change makers. And so we're kind of coming to them and saying, okay, we have access to these pooled funds. We have a set of funders who want to make progress on equity and want to actually take action on all these things we're talking about. And they're aware that they're not best positioned to design a grant making model that'll meet your needs. So what do you think? What are the challenges you're facing? What are the gaps in which type of funding, in which type of capacity support? And how do we design a model around that primarily meets your needs? And then secondary, we can kind of solve a lot of problems for funders who want to move money in this way. And I would say that has dramatically changed how we as a fund are approaching our grant making, dramatically changed how we think about a model of grant making that provides kind of wraparound support to these entities, as well as being a fund that is very funding centric and just gets funding flowing, because that's one of the biggest gaps. So I think there's a lot of different ways there. You can completely restructure how you do your giving to do it directly. I want to be a proponent that is possible. And also we're not the only bridge fund who is trying to bridge this gap. But I think look at who's really making decisions at the high level, understand the representation or lack thereof on your own teams, on your own boards, to make decisions by people who really understand the problems you're seeking to support.
And Frank, this is something that you mentioned earlier, and I think Katie just touched on this, is that there is a broader ecosystem, of course, in which everyone is operating, and that the monetary component is just one piece of the puzzle. Can you speak to some of the other pieces that need to fall into place? You talked a little bit about this earlier, but perhaps unpack a little bit more of what we as donors and funders and those of us interested in supporting African visionaries can do to help them, that goes beyond simply just writing a check.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we almost have to employ some of the discipline we as investors have used to make money that we're deploying now in our social investments as well. Sometimes we tend to separate our processes when you're making both. But the reality, if you're going to invest in a private business, you'll do your due diligence, you look at the team, you look at the capabilities and see, do they have the capacity to take this to the vision that the founders or the team thinks they could? And I think some of that stuff is no different in the social space. So some of the non-financial support, for example, is looking at the capabilities of the team. How well are they in terms of people and talent required to take it to the next level? Because sometimes it's not necessarily the founder who should be taking the organization forward. We need to be very open about that. Sometimes it's looking at the reality of the spaces they're going and helping them understand the barriers or the opportunities ahead. Sometimes it's looking at stuff even around the capabilities around marketing and all those kind of things. So there's a whole wraparound suite of competencies that are non-financial that would hold them back, irrespective of how much money they got if they've not been fixed. So I think that's another thing we need to look at. The second thing I think we need to look at is always, and I think we've not been very deliberate about this, is some of the problems we're trying to solve in Africa have been solved by other people for a long time. And we've not been very deliberate to think, where can we look for lessons learned and bring them to accelerate Africa's progress? Okay, and too many times, some of us as international investors already have invested in Asia or in Latin America, and there are places where some of these problems have been solved for the last 5-10 years, and we don't need to replicate the same mistakes that people in other places have made. And I think that's another value that international investors could do, is bring your wealth of a global experience into the continent as well, and help us avoid mistakes and accelerate our learning as fast as possible, and reduce the cost of losses or mistakes that we could make in trying to solve our own problems.
The sharing of best practices and identifying them, and we all think that we don't have to recreate the wheel every time we do this. So there's no doubt that there's an opportunity there. Keith, you focus more specifically on small and medium-sized enterprises, which make up about 90% of all the businesses in Africa. And you mentioned earlier that there was a huge financing gap in the space. What are you seeing, and what can you tell us a little bit more about how to bridge that gap and how to support SMEs in the work that they're trying to accomplish in terms of change and their success on the continent?
Thank you very much. I'm seeing an interesting development that is happening. It's almost a bridge between philanthropy and investment. And I'll give you an example of what I see happening, in that we are seeing philanthropists coming and making investments, but instead of those investments actually going back to the philanthropist investor, they are almost utilized as flexible funding. So in a way, you end up having a philanthropist actually meeting the social, investment objectives that they may want or have. And then you're also having the certain level of investment that, for lack of a better word, these philanthropists can afford to lose or afford to risk. Because what traditionally has been the challenge is that because of the size of the small and medium-sized enterprises, the big investors really, either they are too small or the risk is too great. And so they've tended to just stay away from what they call the missing middle. And what we are actually now doing, like for example at Abantu, what we are doing is that we are going to the philanthropists and saying, actually, instead of giving us a donation, give us a loan. And we shall give that loan at very, modest interest, because we want the SMEs to also have some skin in the game. And when that is paid back, it comes back as unrestricted income that then goes back into the fund. So you tend to have an interesting mix of philanthropy and impact investment that almost removes the big risk that a traditional investor would have, that they would expect to only invest in tried, sizable ventures. So that is really an example of what I see happening and what we are advocating for, by removing the risk from the person who is actually making the money, but also making sure that the bulk of SMEs, who are not asking for much actually, 20,000, 50,000, 100,000, which makes a whole lot of difference, can actually get access to that money. But to add to Frank's point, in that while we are providing that money, we are also providing the education. How do you set up a plan? How do you do your HR? How do you do your accountability? And the third leg to this is actually doing those contacts. Because, and this is interesting, I once spoke to a lady who has a small enterprise in Uganda. And she was like, if you give me a loan now, what would I do with it? So it is the issue of bring in the capital, but upscale up the skills, and at the same time do that whole thing of, if you could get mentors, if you get contacts, it's all those business contacts that some of these SMEs actually do not have, because they are largely working in isolation. So although I've diverted a bit from the capital bit, but it is all the three that work together, and that is I wouldn't say new, but that is a different way of looking at investment that is coming from a philanthropic side.
And Keith, and this is a question for all of you, but Keith, are you seeing, it sounds like there's a greater need for collaboration amongst the donors and funders, philanthropists and investors, whether it's homegrown or international, to really understand where the needs are and how to, to your point, how do you address that, the missing middle? Is there enough of that going on? And do we need more collaboration and conversations and discourse amongst the investors and donors to understand where we can be most effective?
I mean, you can never have too much collaboration. If I said we have enough collaboration, I would be absolutely dead wrong, and yep. It would be literally counterproductive. When we talk about the donors, investors or donors, we need more collaboration. But that has, I must give due, I must recognize where that has already happened. We are seeing more and more collaboration when it comes to really some sizable investors and donors that are coming in to actually solve some really sizable issues. I will give an example of a philanthropist in Tanzania who has, very many factories and has been doing a lot on the private side, but he's now coming in and actually working with UNICEF and working with Save the Children to actually solve the issue of malnutrition. And that is an example of collaboration that is not just going from one donor to other, but donors to government to private sector. And it is really changing the dial, and it is actually proving to be very effective on scale. So for me, I feel that COVID has forced us to collaborate more, but we could do it better and we could do it smarter. There are still many pockets whereby one donor will come and flood a village with hospitals or with clinics, but then not look at the nurses. And then another comes and does the same, build more clinics, and then no one is looking at the nurses. And yet together they could have actually looked at how they fix this problem differently. So for me, I feel that we are getting there. Technology is helping. COVID and the lockdown has forced us to stop and listen and to rethink how it works. But I would want to see more, and probably Katie can speak more about this, more inter and intra investor philanthropy collaboration, but also out of that bubble, going also into the private sector and government as well.
Katie, let's pivot to looking ahead, I think, and what excites you about the continent and certainly post COVID. But what does the future look like when you think about African visionaries and the changes and the potential that's there, and the sort of models that Keith sort of just referred to in terms of greater collaboration? What do you see when you look ahead, and what does it look like?
Yeah, I think it's helpful to give a disclaimer that I am an optimist, and very proud of my optimism. I actually think that when you think really deeply about what a visionary means, and what we talked about earlier, seeing possible where other people don't see it, the core of that is optimism. So despite 2020 being a pretty rough year for the world, and particularly in the country I'm from, in America, I definitely still see a lot of potential. I think I'm very excited. I think when I think about the future of the African continent, to me, it feels like there is this moment where there is more and more awareness that African visionaries need to be centered in all these conversations. And when I think about collaboration between funders and investors, I think yes, and whose voice is centered in the decision making in those collaborations. If it's just funders talking to each other and they don't have an understanding of which villages need what, we're going to keep perpetuating the same problems. And so how do you have collaboration that is, investors, doers, whether they be nonprofits, for-profit social enterprises, community leaders, how do you have collaboration that really centers the people most proximal to the problem, and then kind of allows everyone else to find their supporting role around that centered vision? And, I think that what I think is particularly exciting, although it took a really difficult year and a huge global crisis to somehow unlock some of this awareness, is that, COVID, I'm sure, is one of many future global crises that continues to emphasize that the people on the ground are the ones who are going to deliver change. They're the ones who can pivot the fastest. They're the ones who can continue to deliver impact when the entire world is shut down. And so it just feels like there's huge potential to put our money where our mouth is around that realization and say, let's collaborate, let's also act on all of this new awareness, and move money in a way that centers African visionaries. And I think if as a sector broadly we do that, there's kind of limitless potential.
Frank, are you an optimist as well? What do you think of change in the African continent as you look ahead? Oh, Frank, I think you're on mute.
Sorry, I was talking to myself. I was saying I have Katie's optimism on steroids, so I'm a super optimist. and especially, I'm a very proud Pan-African optimist. I think for me, this, we're the generation that have had the gift of a crisis. And they always say, never waste one. And I think, we are looking at a space where we've seen what was before, we've seen what has happened after. And it's a really good time for us to ask ourselves, the question is, what are the root causes of some of the challenges we are facing? We struggle with things because our fundamentals around, as Keith said, we haven't trained enough nurses, so it should be no surprise when you can't find enough people to treat our patients. We haven't taught enough kids in school about agriculture. Then we find kids in the crisis of a lockdown, they can't even grow their own vegetables by improvising a home garden. So we've got some very basic things that I think we need to get right. And for me, I think there's no better time for us to be driving hard collaboration, and for a couple of reasons. One, there's not enough resources to go around. A lot of money has been spent on COVID. And many people you talk to right now will tell you, listen, we have no more money for this year, we're only looking for next year. So it's an issue of how do we use the little money we've got smartly to leverage in as much capital into the spaces that we need money in now. So I think perfect time for us to test collaboration models, perfect time for us to test collaboration relationships beyond our normal circles. So as a philanthropist, how do you look at partnering with private sector people? What can you do to de-risk some of the social investments so they can put in their money in that space? And so some of the work we are doing, for example, in building, like we just built out, we're piloting a deal share platform next week, in fact, as AVPA, and agenda platform is to aggregate investors around these collaboration platforms. And how do we help you as an investor coming from the US to say, how I can make my money more catalytic by co-investing with Africans who already put money in certain projects. So if I came with $1 million, I can find someone who needs $100,000 a year to support 10 businesses in Liberia. I can do another 100,000 in another country in that sense, and not follow the same paths and relationship we've had in the past. So I think this is a really good time for us to be thinking around that kind of stuff. And especially for philanthropists, this is a time for them to be thinking about playing the kind of risk-taking role that we need to get the economies riding again. So kids, small businesses will not survive if they don't have the philanthropists taking risk with them through this point. And right now, as we look at the COVID response time, survival is the new scaling. We shouldn't even be thinking of scaling. We need to be thinking, how can we help these guys, these visions, keep their heads above water? And it asks for us to change our mindset. It asks for us to think differently about our roles. It asks for us to build new partnerships. It asks for us to be really brave and bold in many ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And Keith, optimist or super optimist in terms of Africa?
I think you can tell from my expression. I am so optimistic. And do you know why? Because, oh my God, if you take money away, people get creative because they have no option. I have seen levels of creativity which have even surprised some entrepreneurs themselves. This morning, I was chatting on Facebook, an entrepreneur who, because they just could not move, decided to try Facebook. And this is the oldest story in the book, but he is selling more now than he sold before. And that is because he just decided to put everything on Facebook, and now he has a following of 40,000. He's not a guru of any form or shape, but he had no option but to just post what he was doing on Facebook. Now that is one person, and that is one example. I can quote very many other examples of people where money has been taken away and they have been forced to be creative. And so and I hope this happens, that when we start having that conversation with our donors, with our investors, we are not going to come with the give us or we die attitude. I hope we come with that attitude of, it would be nice to work with you, but if it doesn't happen, there are options. And for me, that is what makes me optimistic, and I hope that actually happens. So that is where I am. I am like so optimistic, I'm like waving my hands. Yeah.
Well, that's a great note to pivot to our audience now. I think we see a lot of questions that people have for you. So let's do that and see what this discussion has generated with the audience. Thank you all for this piece of it, and let's pivot now to some questions.
All right, I think we're live.
Great.
I think we're back for the Q&A. Lior, I'll hand it over to you.
One of the topics that seems to be for folks in the chat is being allies. And Katie, you mentioned that earlier. Perhaps we can start with what does it look like in practice to be an ally and to reward folks and not think of themselves. I think typically funders think of themselves as gatekeepers, and I think that's it's extremely problematic. So what does it mean to you to be an ally in this space?
Yeah, I think I think there's some. This isn't a new quote, but I think a lot of people talk about allyship as action, and that's really core to being an ally. Is it has to go beyond an intention and into like really you're taking actions in that way. I often think about for myself, I have kind of unearned and undue privilege as a white American woman, as someone who's worked in philanthropy before. And that privilege can be spent. I can spend that for the benefit of people who don't have that undue and kind of unearned privilege. And so I kind of am constantly thinking about if I have that, if I kind of have that proximity to funders or to philanthropy, how do I act in a way? How do I do work in a way that is taking advantage of that in order to in the case of my work, move money to people who don't have that kind of unearned privilege. So that's kind of how I think about it.
Keith, what do you think? What does it mean to be an ally from your perspective?
I mean, in my perspective, I'm an African, and I am also in a privileged position to be able to live in different parts of the world. And with that comes the ability to make really, really great contacts, to learn new things, and to also be able to take a lot from many different parts of the world. And when you are speaking about, being an ally to visionary SMEs, is to actually be able to consult them, is to work with them, is to put them at the center of planning, but then using what their action needs are and using the extent of your contacts, the extent of what you can bring to the table to their advantage. And this, you can see it working very well nowadays, with technology. It works very well with the amount of connectivity that we have. So in my position, I see myself as being able, in whatever city I am in the world, to use that position, to use that as Katie says, that privilege to be able to support others who are in this with us, and we're in this together. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Keith. And Frank, what do you think in terms of being an ally? What does that mean for you when you think about investing?
Yeah, so I think for me, an ally, one of the first things an ally should be able to demonstrate is empathy. Empathy for the circumstances in which some of these social entrepreneurs and investors and visionaries are under, empathy for the problem they're trying to solve, empathy for the community. That's the first thing. I think secondly is to know that we all bring something to this deal. You bring money, I bring local know-how, I bring commitment, I bring passion, and each of those currencies are of equal weight. And the sweet success comes when the two currencies that you bring and I bring gel, and they gel from a position of trying to make both stronger than they would be individually. So I think that's important. And also in terms of respect, cultural respect is very important, recognizing that wherever we go, that's not our home, will be different. And we need to be able to be very culturally sensitive and respect some of the norms that we find in those places. And the third thing is to truly find opportunities to build partnerships. I think we've got to be very considerate that even in situations, it's almost like, when you're raising a child who's a teenager now, you recognize that you can't do some things with a teenager. You've got to be able to talk to them and get them to understand issues. And I think it's very, very similar to that. You've got to recognize that it's a partnership now. And just because I have the money doesn't mean that I have to have the final say necessarily. And sometimes I've got to give as much as they do as well. Leo, over to you.
Leo, is Leo still
Sorry,
there?
I think I'm
I think Leo's network has a problem.
I think we may have lost him, but we can pick up some of the questions that have been coming into the chat. There was one about, and Keith and Frank, feel free to jump in if there's one that you saw that you really want to tackle. There was one about the kind of biggest call to action, which also, since we're kind of coming towards the end of the Future Summit, might be a helpful thing to give to the whole group about, you know, really looking forward from today. How can we all put all of this learning and this discussion and that we're doing into action? And I'll turn it over to Frank and Keith first, whichever one of you want to go.
Oh, Frank, you want to go first?
Yeah, so I think a call to action for me would be, as people who are living in Africa and who want to desire impact, if you're passionate about making the world a better place, if you're passionate about solving problems, either directly as an entrepreneur, as a visionary, or indirectly as a funder, there's no better place to be than in Africa. We'll give you more problem opportunities than you can find anywhere else in the world. And I think that brings together a really good melting pot of opportunities for us to create real change. A better Africa is a better world in many ways. For the African visionaries, I continue to encourage you to please don't stop to solve solutions. Don't stop being entrepreneurial. Don't stop coming up with ideas, because ideas will attract resources. And our job, for those of us who are playing in the ecosystem, is to find opportunities for you to connect with resources. Any ideas that are of opportunity to reach people, sustainably solve problems, and scale where possible, you know, we'll find partners, and it's our job to try and find you and connect with you. So I think the call to action is, let's not stop solving problems. Let's continue to be visionary. Let's continue to be inspiring. Let's continue to be courageous as we live out to make Africa a better place.
I mean, my take on it is, and I'm calling out to, you know, the funders out there, in that we have for a long time had funders that rightfully have got, you know, their funding perimeters, and they've got their focus, and in most cases it's unmovable. We've had funders whereby, you know, you ask for reams and reams and reams of papers and go through so many complicated stages for you to actually be able to support, you know, a charity or an SME out there. And for me, I think the call to action now is that in some cases, and now is a good time, is the level of flexibility is called upon. There are many wonderful ideas, many wonderful organizations out there that, with the right support of the structure of the organization itself, and not just focusing on the program area, is the calling to action of, we need to support those small creative entrepreneurs and SMEs right now, especially in 2020, 2021, where it has just become much harder to attract money because everyone is sitting on their hands. COVID has done a number of us, but through increased flexibility, we can actually support today and now those organizations, so that come 2 to 3 years, they are still around. Because if we do not support them now, we are in a situation whereby in 6 months, in a year's time, a number of them will not be around. So for me, I'm almost calling for the urgency and the immediacy of, let us flexibly support small enterprises, small organizations that need to keep their doors open now, and so that in future we can be able to help them thrive. But right now, it's the survival we should be looking at. Over to you, Katie.
Yeah, I kind of have two different calls to action. So one directed towards visionaries and one kind of more directed at philanthropy. For visionaries, I think just know that like I think the sector like sees you, and stay grounded in the fact that things are really hard. And I hear from so many of you that this year has been so tough, and it only looks more tough looking forward. But you have so much to offer this sector, and the fact that you're not prioritized has nothing to do with that. And so for visionaries, just like stay in the work because we need you. And philanthropy, I think we need to get ourselves together to really resource these organizations. And I would say that in philanthropy, and I would speak more to international philanthropy again, because that's really where kind of the community that I come from, we're very good at talking and learning and talking about learning. And I think that that is great, and it's important because it often does eventually lead to action. But when it comes to bias in our sector and racism in our sector, the lag from talking and learning to action is particularly drawn out. It's particularly long. This is not the first time that this sector has had a reckoning with these issues. You know, I think if you talk to people that have been in philanthropy for as long as I've been alive, this has happened before. We've had this conversation before. And so I think really leaving today and challenging yourself as a funder in this sector, how do I move money? Like, I can keep learning and unlearning. All those things are incredibly important. You can move money at the same time. And so find ways, money's going out of your foundations already, find ways to do that more equitably in the short term. If it's a bridge fund, there's many of us out there who have, you know, local teams that we're supporting to do this work. If it's funding directly, there are ways you can take action and move money now, while also learning and doing the harder work of understanding the deeper kind of structural issues within the philanthropic sector. So just get going. That would be my call to action.
Thanks, Katie. And I if I can put a quick plug in for the work that we're doing at the Roddenberry Foundation, if anyone is interested, we launched a new program called the +1 Global Fund last month, which is really designed to think about philanthropy completely differently and to essentially eliminate applications and restrictions in reporting. And so we're using a nomination framework for identifying and supporting organizations globally. A lot of the folks who we're working with in this first round are based in Africa, and we're working with partners like Acumen and Ashoka and the Resolution Project and the Obama Foundation and others to do this. So there is an opportunity for funders who really want to do something different to jump in and to kind of throw out the funders playbook, which is kind of what we've been trying to do over the last 6 months. So it can be done. We shouldn't be afraid to put our feet in the water and try this. One of the last questions I think we can get to is what can organizations on the continent do, visionaries? What can social entrepreneurs do to get in front of funders? Are there ways that they can do not necessarily a better job, because I think everyone is working as crazy and as hard as they can, but what can they do to stand out and to get the support that they need, either from local funders or from international funders? I'd love to get your thoughts on that. It seems to be something that folks are asking in the chat. What I don't know, Keith, do you want to start with thinking about that?
Absolutely. You know, half the time I'm raising money, and one of the things that I do is that I always ask someone who knows someone. And this is also an issue of capacity, because if you are a small organization, you cannot afford to have a scattergun approach. It takes too much effort. It doesn't bring as much ROI, and it is just, you know, it is just heart-wrenching, because you write 500 letters and you probably will get 2 responses back. So for an organization that has got limited resources, limited time, I'm really basically talking practical stuff, is to always ask someone who will introduce you to someone. So for example, if I've been on this course, who has been on this summit, you know, the first people that I'll be Katie and Lior. not because I may actually want money from you, but because you probably know someone who knows someone who will be wanting to fund me. And so I think it is just being a bit more targeted and doing your homework. There's so many things that I see small organizations do and small enterprises do, in that they will write to anyone who is a funder, or even when that person is not either funding in their geographical area or their sector. So just a bit of homework to be more targeted, but also find someone who will give you the queue jumper, who will give you that connection. You'll have more headway getting to where you want to do and raising money in a really, really strategic way, as opposed to really, really just firing off applications. I also feel that there is still an untapped African philanthropy element. And I'm really calling upon those home-based African philanthropists and supporters and corporates. It is time that they actually started putting some money on the table. And so, as if you are on the continent, I would not shy away from looking at our homegrown supporters. I mean, COVID has been an example of how much money is on the continent. You know, when you look at South Africa, you know, we had, you know, billions of rands being given to COVID. When you look at Nigeria, when you look at Kenya, you know, those are some of the countries that we're talking about whereby there's actually money in the economy. So I would also not discount looking back home and looking locally, but at the same time using that strategic approach to get to those funders. I can speak about it all day, but I'll stop there.
Frank, what do you think? What can organizations do? And, you know, Keith speaks to this idea of social capital, kind of like leveraging who you know, which is it's sort of its own conversation that we don't have time for. But what do you think organizations and visionaries can do to get in front of local and international funders?
Yeah, so I think the first thing I want to echo Keith's thing is you need to work your network. I mean, there's no replacing knowing who knows someone. That's just inevitable. Second thing, I think you've got to understand what are the people you're approaching looking for before they deploy money, and how investor ready are you as an individual or as an organization to earn the right, because it's not your right, to earn the right to actually get money from that person. I think that's the second thing. The third thing is we need to get out of the mindset of just thinking grants when you're looking for additional capital. Too many times we're stuck in this grant mentality, and all we want to do is just think about grants. And sometimes we actually have organizations that have some IP that could attract some patient capital as well. That's, you know, semi-commercial. And this is why we're not thinking about potential investors. There's a whole continuum of capital out there that looks at, there's grants, there's impact funds, there's private sector capital. And if you position yourself properly and you present a good sustainable case, you have a chance to open your options of money beyond grants. So I think people need to think about that. And then the last thing in my view is what I've seen is sometimes people are not very clear about the problem they're solving, and then they don't sell enough their progress to date. What progress have I made to date that makes me want to come for more money to either grow or scale? And I think we could do a better job of selling our stories.
Thank you, Keith. Last word on this, what folks do.
Yeah, I'll be quick because I know we have a dance party next that I'm sure everyone's excited to get to, as am I. But I think coming back to kind of allyship, like who are your allies, and not just funders, peers, and straight up ask them for introductions. Like if you have a current funder, I would hope, because good funders will do this, they would be open to make introductions for you to other funders. And that goes a long way because they talk about, you know, why they've invested and why they believe in your vision and believe in your work. Peers can also do that. You know, I think funders also put a lot of weight in the recommendations from their current grantees because they believe in them, believe in their vision, believe in their work, and will take that recommendation. So I think find ways to ask your allies, your peers, and your funders for introductions so that you are getting onto networks that you might not otherwise have access to. And then I think when you're in conversations with funders, I think sometimes this power dynamic happens I mean, there's lots of power dynamics in funder-doer conversations, but one of the ones that I've seen play out is kind of funders actually not maybe understanding a context, but not knowing how to ask about it. And so then the kind of organization feels like they have to justify the way they do their work. And I think if you take a lens of more that you are creating an opportunity for that funder to learn about your context, and that they want to understand it, they want to learn from you, and you have so much to bring to that conversation. I think it can just help kind of tamp that down a little bit, so that you're really able to ask them questions about what do they look for. I think all that kind of work in conversation to build relationships with funders really goes a long way. And I would always emphasize that funders have a lot of work to do to kind of meet organizations in that space of equalizing those relationships.
Great. Well, thank you, Keith, Katie, Frank. I think we are at the end of our session. Hundreds, I'm sure we could all speak for many more hours about this, but dance party, I guess, is coming up. So thank you all. Speak to you soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.